Welcome to A Quiet Place for Tired Minds, a series of calm reflections for overwhelmed humans living in a noisy world. Who are you trying to impress? Pause with that question for a moment. Not because the answer is obvious, but because it may be quieter than you expect. Maybe it is not one person. Maybe it is the world, the internet, your past, your family, someone who once made you feel small, someone who is no longer even in your life. Or maybe, without realizing it, you have been trying to impress a version of yourself that was built from pressure, fear, and old expectations. And perhaps this is where the exhaustion begins. Not from work alone, not from responsibility alone, not from modern life alone, but from the invisible performance of trying to be acceptable everywhere you go. Have you ever noticed how differently you can become yourself depending on the room? In one place, your voice feels natural. In another, you measure every word before it leaves your mouth. With one person, your laugh arrives freely. With another, you become careful. You shrink a little, you soften your opinion, you explain yourself more than necessary. You smile when something does not feel right. You say, "It's fine," when something inside you knows it is not. And nobody may have asked you to change, but somehow you already had. And perhaps the real question is not which version of me is fake. Perhaps the deeper question is, which version of me finally feels safe enough to be real? Because many people are not pretending in some dramatic way. They are simply adapting to be liked, adapting to avoid conflict, adapting to stay accepted, adapting not to disappoint anyone, adapting because somewhere along the way they learn that being fully themselves comes with consequences. And when you do this for long enough, it starts to feel normal. You do not call it performance. You call it being polite, being professional, being easygoing, mature, being strong. But sometimes underneath all of that, there is a tired human being quietly wondering, when did I stop feeling like myself? That question can arrive softly, maybe while driving home in silence, maybe while sitting with coffee after a long day, maybe after laughing with people, then feeling strangely empty afterwards. And this is where modern life becomes confusing, because the world does not always ask you to be honest. It often asks you to be impressive. It rewards the polished version, the confident version, the version that knows what to say, the version that looks like it has everything together. So people learn to present themselves before they understand themselves. They learn what looks good before they learn what feels true. And slowly life becomes less about living and more about being perceived. But being perceived is exhausting, because when you are always wondering how you appear, you cannot fully rest inside who you are. You begin watching yourself live, checking yourself, editing yourself, measuring, wondering how you are coming across. And after a while, even simple moments become performance. A conversation, a message, a decision. Everything starts to pass through the same quiet question. Will this make me more accepted or less? And maybe this is one of the greatest hidden tiredness of modern life. Not just physical tiredness, not just mental tiredness, but identity tiredness. The tiredness of constantly managing who you are allowed to be. Because there is a certain kind of exhaustion that comes from always being almost yourself, almost honest, almost relaxed, almost open, almost free. Close enough to function, but not close enough to feel at home. And this is not because people are weak. It is because belonging is one of the deepest human needs we have. Human beings are wired to care whether they are accepted. Long ago, belonging was survival. To be rejected from the group was dangerous. To be left out was not only emotional pain, it was threat. And even though, in a different world, the nervous system still remembers. That is why criticism can feel so sharp, why rejection can feel so heavy, why being misunderstood can stay with us longer than we want it to. Your mind may say, it doesn't matter, but your body may still feel the old ache of exclusion. So perhaps it makes sense that many people learn to perform, not because they are fake, but because some part of them is still trying to stay safe. And this is where we need compassion. Because it is easy to say, just be yourself. But for many people, being themselves has not always felt safe. Maybe you were laughed at. Maybe you were judged. Maybe you were too sensitive for some people. Too quiet, too loud, too emotional, too different. Too much. And when you hear these messages often enough, you begin to edit yourself before anyone else gets the chance. You learn to arrive already filtered. And perhaps that is one of the saddest things modern life teaches people. To become acceptable before becoming authentic. But authenticity is not loud. It is not always bold. It is not always dramatic. It does not always announce itself. Sometimes authenticity is simply noticing the moment you are about to abandon yourself and choosing not to. A small pause, a slower breath, a softer truth. Maybe saying, actually, I do not agree. Or, I need some time. Or maybe saying, that does not feel right for me. Or maybe saying nothing at all and simply refusing to betray your own inner knowing. Because not every act of self-respect is visible. Some of the most important ones happens quietly, inside the body, inside the breath, inside the moment where you decide not to shrink, just to keep someone else comfortable. And maybe this is where freedom begins, not in becoming impressive, but in becoming less willing to disappear. There is something I find fascinating about human beings. Most of us spend years learning who other people want us to become before we ever ask ourselves who we actually are. Think about it. From childhood, we are gently rewarded for fitting in. The child who behaves, the student who gets the grades, the employee who never complains, the person who keeps everyone happy, the friend who never says no. Little by little, approval begins shaping identity. Not because anyone planned it, but because human beings naturally learn acceptance. When something earns love, we repeat it. When something earns rejection, we quietly hide it. And over time, those tiny adjustments become a personality. Not fake, simply adopted. But have you ever wondered how many parts of yourself you've slowly packed away? Simply because one day someone made you believe they were too much? Perhaps it wasn't even intentional. A teacher laughed. A parent criticized. Someone called you sensitive. Someone told you to grow up or roll the dice when you got excited. Or someone said, don't be so emotional. Tiny moments, almost forgettable. Yet, the nervous system remembers. Because the nervous system isn't keeping score of facts. It keeps score of safety. Maybe that's why some adults apologize before they speak. Maybe that's why some people laugh after expressing an opinion, instead of asking permission for having one. Maybe that's why some people explain themselves far more than necessary. Not because they owe an explanation, because somewhere inside, they're still hoping not to be misunderstood. Have you ever noticed it? How exhausting it is to constantly explain who you are? To justify your decisions, to defend your boundaries, to make your choices acceptable to everyone else. And perhaps that's because your soul was never designed to live in a courtroom, always defending itself, always presenting evidence, always proving its worth. Here's something I don't think we talk about enough. Some people aren't afraid of failure. They're afraid of disappointing people. There's a difference. Failure hurts. Disappointment can make us question who we are. So people become careful with dreams, careful with opinions, careful with happiness, success, even careful with joy. Because joy attracts attention. Success attracts opinions. Authenticity attracts misunderstanding. And for someone who spends years trying to avoid rejection, being fully seen can feel strangely frightening. It is interesting. Children rarely ask, will people approve of this? They paint, they sing, they dance boldly. They laugh loudly. They wear ridiculous outfits. They ask impossible questions. They are wonderfully unconcerned with appearing impressive. Then slowly something changes. Not overnight, not dramatically, quietly, almost invisibly. One comment, one embarrassment, one comparison, another and another, until eventually many adults spend years trying to recover the freedom they were born with. Maybe growing older was never supposed to mean becoming less yourself. Maybe maturity was never meant to cost authenticity. Perhaps true maturity is having the courage to return to it. But there's another question hiding underneath all of this. One that's changing the way I think. What if the people you're trying so hard to impress aren't thinking about you nearly as much as you imagine? It's a strange thought, liberating and slightly uncomfortable. Because we spend so much energy imagining other people's opinions. Yet everyone else is usually busy worrying about themselves. They're wondering if they're good enough, successful enough, interesting enough, accepted enough. They're carrying their own invisible questions, just like you. And perhaps that's one of the greatest misunderstandings of modern life. We're all quietly performing for an audience that's mostly performing too. Have you ever sat somewhere busy and simply watched people, not judging, just noticing? Faces rushing past, shoulders carrying invisible weight, eyes looking tired, conversations half finished. And I often wonder how many people walking past are quietly asking themselves, am I enough? Not out loud, never out loud, just beneath the surface. A question so common that it almost becomes part of being human. But maybe it doesn't have to stay that way. Maybe there comes a moment when life gently asks us a different question. Not how can I become more impressive, but who am I when nobody expects anything from me. Imagine just for a moment that there was no audience, no expectations, no comparisons, no social media, no labels, no pressure to prove yourself. Who would you become? Or perhaps the better question is, who would you still be standing when everything you were performing quietly fell away? Perhaps the greatest tragedy is not the people wear masks. Perhaps it's that after wearing them for long enough, they begin to mistake the mask for themselves. Think about that for a moment. If you spend years introducing the edited version of yourself, how would you even recognize the original one anymore? Maybe that's why so many people quietly say, I don't really know who I am. Not because they have no identity, because they've spent so many years adapting that they've forgotten what feels natural. And maybe this is why silence feels uncomfortable for so many people. Because when the world finally becomes quiet, there is nobody left to perform for, only yourself. And perhaps that's the first time your real voice has a chance to speak. There's a reason so many people feel uncomfortable sitting alone without distraction. Not because solitude is frightening, because solitude removes the audience. No notifications, no expectations, no applause, no criticism, just you. And for someone who has spent years becoming what everyone else needed, meeting themselves again can feel strangely unfamiliar. Nature always has fascinated me. Not because it is perfect, because nothing in nature seems interested in pretending. The trees do not compare with the flowers. The mountains do not wake each morning wondering whether they are impressive enough. Even the smallest wildflower blooms without asking permission. And somehow, human beings become the only part of nature constantly trying to become something else. Perhaps we have forgotten that we belong here too. Sometimes I wonder, what would happen if people measured their lives differently? Not how successful was I, not how many people approve of me, but how often did I feel completely myself? That question changes everything. Because suddenly, life is no longer about building an image. It becomes about building a relationship. The relationship you have with yourself. Here's something I've noticed. The happiest people I've ever met weren't necessarily the most successful. They weren't the richest. or the most confident, or the most impressive. They simply looked comfortable inside their own skin. There's something incredibly peaceful about a person who no longer needs to convince the world of who they are. They simply are. And somehow, everyone around them can feel it. Perhaps confidence isn't speaking the loudest. Perhaps confidence is no longer editing yourself every 5 minutes, nor rehearsing every conversation afterwards, not wondering whether people like you, not carrying every opinion home with you. Maybe confidence feels quieter than we imagine it. Imagine living one day without trying to impress anyone. No invisible competition, no comparison, no proving, no performing, no shrinking, just living. Can you imagine how light that would feel? Or perhaps, can you remember? Because I don't think children dream about becoming impressive. They dream about becoming astronauts, artists, explorers, gardeners, teachers, writers. They dream because something inside them feels alive. Not because someone else might approve. Maybe adulthood slowly replaces curiosity with approval. And perhaps that's one of the greatest losses we never notice happening. But here's a question that stayed with me for a long time. What if your greatest fear isn't actually rejection? What if it's acceptance for someone you were never meant to become? Imagine spending years becoming the version everyone applauds, only to realize they never truly knew you. That would be a lonely kind of success. There is a quiet sadness in living in a life that looks successful from the outside, while feeling like a stranger inside it. People may admire the image, the career, the confidence, the lifestyle, but admiration can never replace authenticity. Because deep down, the soul knows the difference. It knows when it's breathing freely, and it knows when it's simply surviving behind another performance. Maybe this is why some people feel unexpectedly emotional during ordinary moments. Walking alone, watching the sea, sitting beneath the trees, driving with no music. For a few minutes, the performance stops, and the real self quietly whispers, I'm still here, waiting, not angry, not disappointed, simply waiting for you to notice. And perhaps coming back to yourself isn't one dramatic decision. Perhaps it happens one honest moment at a time. One boundary, one conversation, one quiet no, one brave yes, one decision to stop apologizing for existing, one afternoon spent exactly as your heart needed, instead of how the world expected. Small moments, quiet moments, almost invisible, yet they slowly become your life. Perhaps there comes a quiet moment in every life when we stop asking, "What do people expect from me?" and begin asking, "What feels true to me?" It is such a small change in words, yet it changes the direction of entire life. Because expectations ask us to perform. Truth asks us to listen. And listening has become a rare skill. Not because people have forgotten how, because the world became so loud that many can no longer hear themselves thinking. Maybe that little voice inside you hasn't disappeared. Perhaps it has simply been waiting for enough silence or finally be heard again. We often imagine freedom as something dramatic, leaving everything behind, starting over, changing careers, moving somewhere new, beginning a completely different life. But perhaps real freedom arrives much more quietly. It begins the day you stop introducing yourself through other people's expectations. The day you stop asking, "Will they approve?" before asking, "Does this feel honest?" There is something beautiful or peaceful about a person who no longer needs explain every decision. Not because they have stopped caring, because they have finally stopped negotiating with their own heart. Imagine how much energy we spend trying to avoid disappointing people. Now imagine using the same energy to become fully present in your own life. Perhaps this is why peace feels unfamiliar to so many people. Because for years, their identity has been built around proving they are capable, proving they are worthy, they are enough, proving they deserve love. What an exhausting way to live, always auditioning for a role you already had. Because here's something I have been quietly thinking about. The sun never wakes up trying to prove that it deserves to rise. The ocean never apologizes for reaching the shore. The trees never compare their height before they bloom. Nature simply becomes. Patiently, quietly, without performance, without applause. Perhaps we belong to that same rhythm. And what if the life you've been searching for doesn't begin when you become someone different? What if it begins the moment you stop abandoning yourself to become acceptable to everyone else? Maybe that phone call where you finally speak honestly. Maybe that invitation you politely decline because your soul needs rest. Maybe choosing the slower path. Maybe wearing what you actually love. Maybe laughing louder. Or crying without apologizing. Maybe saying, I don't know. Or I've changed my mind. Tiny moments, almost invisible, yet every one of them whispers the same thing. I'm coming home. Home. What a beautiful word. Most people think of a place, but perhaps home is also a feeling. The feeling of no longer needing to perform. The feeling of being able to excel completely. The feeling of sitting quietly with yourself and not wishing you were someone else. Maybe that is what we've been searching for all along. Not perfection, not success, not admiration, just home. There's a quiet quote I once heard that stayed with me. Be careful not to spend your whole life climbing a ladder, only to realize it was leaning against the wrong wall. I think about that often. Not because success is wrong, but because sometimes we become so busy chasing the life we think we should want that we never stop to ask whether it was our dream or somebody else's expectation. Perhaps one day, many years from now, you won't remember how many people approved of you. You won't remember how many strangers agreed with your opinions. You won't remember every achievement, every title, every perfect moment. But I hope you remember that day you felt alive. The walks where your shoulders finally relaxed. The conversations where you didn't pretend. The sunsets you watched all the way to the end. The mornings you moved slowly. The people who loved the real you. The moments when your heart quietly whispered, this feels like me. Because perhaps those moments were never ordinary. Perhaps they were your life. So who are you trying to impress? Maybe the answer matters less now than it did some minutes ago, because perhaps the better question is this: who have you been forgetting while trying to impress everyone else? Maybe it was your curiosity, maybe your joy, maybe your gentleness, or creativity, or laughter, or maybe your peace. You've simply been missing yourself. And if that's true, please know this: you haven't gone anywhere. You are not lost. You are not broken. You are not too late. You are simply beneath the noise, waiting patiently for yourself to return. Thank you for walking beside me. Thank you for slowing down with me. And thank you for giving yourself these quiet moments in a world that rarely stops moving. If these reflections help you feel a little more at home with yourself, then This Is Quiet Place will always be here whatever you need it. Until next time, take gentle care of your mind, protect your peace, and don't forget, the world may ask you to become many different things, but your soul has only ever been asking you to become yourself.